Imagine a winter midnight in 2026, where the fog rolls thick over the Thames, swallowing the ancient spires of London in a cold, grey embrace. Behind the heavy, gold-trimmed curtains of Sandringham, a single desk lamp burns, casting long, jagged shadows against walls that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. King Charles III, a man whose reign has been defined by a silent battle with illness and an even louder battle for the soul of his family, sits with a heavy fountain pen in hand. This is not a routine administrative task. This is the moment the mask of mercy finally slips, revealing the cold, hard steel of a monarch who has been pushed too far. Before him lies a document bearing the royal seal, a final eviction notice addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. To the world, Harry and Meghan were a bridge to the future. To Charles, at this moment, they are a leak that is slowly sinking the royal ship. The atmosphere is thick with a tension that would make anyone shudder. This isn't just about Frogmore Cottage or a piece of real estate in California. This is about the total removal of the Sussexes from the royal ecosystem. Charles is no longer acting as a father yearning for his lost son. He is acting as the sovereign protecting the crown from a slow, agonizing erosion. He knows that every time a private conversation is sold for a headline, every time a sacred tradition is mocked for a documentary, the foundation of the Windsor dynasty cracks just a little more. William stands by the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass, his jaw set in a line of unwavering resolve. The new king in waiting has long been the architect of this cold purge. He has watched his father struggle with sentimentality, but tonight, there is no room for tears. The decision is final. The locks are being changed. The royal titles are being reviewed under a microscope of betrayal. As the pen touches the paper, the scratch of the nib sounds like a death knell for the relationship that once defined the modern monarchy. Charles isn't just signing a notice. He is signing a confession that the dream of reconciliation is dead. The palace is closing its gates, and for Harry and Meghan, the lights are going out for the very last time. But the most shocking part is not the eviction itself. It is what Harry discovered in the fine print, a secret clause that proves the palace has been tracking their every move, every financial transaction, and every whisper since they stepped away to find their privacy. The world thinks they know the story of the Sussexes, but as we peel back the layers of this 2026 crisis, you will realize that the truth is far more dangerous, far more calculated, and far more tragic than any tabloid dared to print. The monarchy doesn't just manage feelings, it manages survival. And tonight, survival looks like an empty house and a silent phone. This is the day the palace stopped hiding behind space and recovery and started fighting for its life. The silence following the signature was not one of peace, but of a cold, calculated transition. As the king retreated into the shadows of Sandringham, the mechanical heart of the monarchy, the audit teams and the constitutional lawyers began their work in the dim light of the royal archives. Prince William, the architect of this new era of transparency, stood over a mountain of digital evidence that had been gathered with surgical precision. This wasn't just a reaction to a memoir or a Netflix series. This was about a massive financial discrepancy that had been quietly leaking from the royal sovereign grant for over 18 months. William's eyes narrowed as he reviewed the sub-accounts associated with overseas security and logistical support. On paper, these funds were meant to protect the dignity of the crown abroad, but the reality was a tangled web of shell companies and consulting fees that led directly back to Montecito. The palace machine had discovered that while Harry and Meghan publicly preached about financial independence, they were allegedly benefiting from a backdoor funding stream facilitated by a small group of loyalists still embedded within the old palace structure. This was the truth dragged out at the last possible moment that finally broke the king's patience. The tension in the room was palpable as William pulled a specific file labeled Project Phoenix. Inside were transcripts of private communications that had bypassed the official encrypted channels of the palace. They revealed a plan to leverage the Sussex brand in a way that directly competed with the crown's charitable interests in the Commonwealth. To William, this was not just a family feud. It was institutional sabotage. He understood that a monarchy that cannot control its narrative is a monarchy on its way to extinction. They didn't just manage the optics, William whispered to his senior advisor. They tried to control reality itself. The decision to issue the eviction notice was the first domino in a total structural reset. It was a message to every member of the royal family. Loyalty to the crown is not optional, and the blood of the king is not a shield for corruption or secrecy. The masks were dropping, and the system was reaching its breaking point. But as the audit team dug deeper, they found a connection that made even William's blood run cold. A series of transfers led from a Sussex-linked trust fund to an offshore account that had been dormant since the days of the Diana investigations. The ghosts of the past were being weaponized to fund a war against the future. The final eviction notice was no longer just about a house. It was about cauterizing a wound that had been festering for decades. The silence of the California morning was shattered not by a phone call, but by the arrival of a formal courier, hand-delivering a document that carried the weight of 1,000 years of tradition turned into a weapon. In the sun-drenched halls of their Montecito mansion, Harry and Meghan were confronted with the reality they had spent years trying to outrun. The palace had finally stopped reacting and started acting. As Harry broke the wax seal on the final eviction notice, the atmosphere changed from one of defiant independence to a chilling realization of total isolation. This was not the usual back-and-forth PR battle they had become accustomed to. There were no recovery periods or privacy buffers offered in this text. Instead, the document outlined a cold, surgical severance of every remaining logistical tie to the United Kingdom. According to internal reports, the shock in the Sussex household was profound, a system reaching its breaking point as the one person who had always served as their emotional bridge, King Charles, had finally chosen the crown over the father-son bond. Meghan's reaction was reportedly one of cold calculation, recognizing that the palace machine they had long criticized had now evolved into something far more dangerous under William's shadow. The eviction notice was accompanied by a summary of the financial discrepancies William had unearthed, a subtle but terrifying warning that the palace was no longer willing to manage the optics of their alleged double-dealing. The message was clear. If you continue to sell the story, we will publish the ledger. In a moment of honest vulnerability that the palace machine never expected, Harry reportedly reached out to his father through a private line, only to find that the protocol had changed. The king was not available. His heir, Prince William, was now the gatekeeper of the royal narrative. The final notice wasn't just about a house in Windsor. It was the formal declaration that the Sussexes were no longer a branch of the family, but a liability being liquidated. As Harry looked out over the Pacific, the realization began to sink in. They hadn't just lost their home. They had lost their leverage. The palace had dropped the mask, and what lay beneath was a monarchy that had learned how to bleed and, more importantly, how to heal by cutting away the parts that threatened its survival. The Montecito dream was suddenly feeling like a very gilded cage, and the key had just been turned from the outside. The fallout from the Montecito confrontation began to bleed into the corridors of Westminster, creating a constitutional tremor that King Charles could no longer ignore. As the news of the final eviction notice reached the public, the palace found itself in a high-stakes war of narratives. While the king remained behind closed doors, a new and deadly leak began to circulate through the British press. A series of venomous memos that supposedly detailed Meghan's private strategic plans to reset her own brand at the expense of the monarchy's stability. This was the moment the palace machine decided to drop the guard and play a dangerous game of truth. For years, the royal family had relied on the never complain, never explain mantra, but under the quiet influence of Prince William, that protocol was being rewritten in real time. The king's gambit was simple. Total transparency regarding the Sussexes' financial demands, a move designed to expose the deep conflict between protecting an ancient institution and satisfying a modern celebrity ego. Charles, despite his physical fragility, reportedly held an emergency meeting with his most trusted advisors, including the new king in waiting. It was here that the king allegedly threw a classified file onto the table, declaring, "No more hiding." He had seen enough evidence of what he called institutional sabotage to realize that a father's love could no longer serve as a shield for a son's betrayal. This wasn't just about privacy. It was a test case for the survival of the crown in the 21st century. The leak of these private memos acted as a confession from the heart of the palace, showing that the royal household was no longer afraid of a scandal. They were more afraid of the vague statements and polished lines that had allowed the Sussexes to control the narrative for so long. As the public reacted with a mixture of shock and support for the king's firm stance, the mask of the fairy tale monarchy slipped further, revealing a system that was finally forced to admit it can bleed. However, the risk was immense. By exposing Harry and Meghan's alleged double-dealing, Charles was also exposing the fragile future of his own reign. The ghosts of past leaks and media settlements loomed large, threatening to drag additional names, including those previously shielded like Prince Andrew, back into the light of public scrutiny. The king had made his move, but the venom was now out in the world, and there was no way to tell who would be poisoned next. While King Charles and Prince William operated with the cold precision of a military strike, it was Catherine, the Princess of Wales, who stepped into the emotional center of this unprecedented crisis. Known for her honest vulnerability, Kate realized that the palace machine's current trajectory, while necessary for survival, risked alienating the public by appearing too ruthless. Behind the closed doors of Adelaide Cottage, Kate reportedly held a series of private meetings with the king, urging him to transform this purge into a monarchy reset. She understood that for the institution to survive, it could no longer be seen as just a harmless fairy tale. It had to prove its humanity. Kate's intervention was not about leniency for Harry and Meghan. It was about owning the story. She proposed a radical shift in how the palace handled the eviction. Instead of a simple get-out order, it would be framed as a rebalancing of royal resources to prioritize those who serve the crown with dignity and transparency. This was the Kate effect in action, taking a cold palace statement and injecting it with a sense of humanity versus the institution. She reportedly told William that the silence in a public institution had already created a crisis of trust, and the only way out was no more hiding. Her strategy involved a carefully timed series of public engagements that showcased the fragile future of the monarchy through a lens of service and resilience. By focusing on her work in early childhood and mental health, she created a sharp contrast to the Sussex brand of celebrity and complaint. Kate was effectively rewriting the monarchy's script, moving it away from polished lines toward a more humanized version of power. This was her way of resetting the monarchy by turning a family tragedy into a test case for institutional evolution. However, Kate's silent power play also served a darker purpose. By dropping the guard and being more open about her own struggles, she made the Sussexes' grievances look fragile and self-serving by comparison. She gave the public what the palace machine never could, a reason to believe that the crown can bleed and still remain unbreakable. As the king signed off on Kate's reset plan, the eviction notice was no longer just an end. It was the beginning of a new reign, where the rules of engagement had been permanently altered by the princess herself. As the official eviction notice reverberated through the halls of Westminster, a massive curiosity loop exploded globally regarding the true catalyst behind King Charles's sudden, iron-fisted resolve. This was no longer about vague rumors or family disagreements. It was about the financial doomsday files, a series of internal leaks from the palace's most sensitive audit departments. These documents were not just spreadsheets. They were the smoking gun that proved a system had reached its ultimate breaking point. Internal reports originating from the king's private office allegedly revealed a staggering trail of reallocated funds. Large sums of money, originally earmarked under the Royal Sovereign Grant for Security and International Logistics, had supposedly been diverted to fuel the Sussexes' private media machine in California. The palace machine had been quietly tracking these financial footprints for months, waiting for the precise moment to pull back the curtain. The secret to this surgical strike lay in the palace's silence. While Harry and Meghan were busy constructing a narrative of independence, Prince William, acting as the ultimate reality controller, had been compiling evidence of how the crown's charitable resources in the Commonwealth were being leveraged to boost the archetype's personal brand. This was the moment the backstage mask was ripped away. Faced with this evidence, King Charles reportedly realized that silence in a public institution is not dignity. It is complicity in a lie. he famously declared to his inner circle, "The exposure must be total." The leak of these files functioned as the monarchy's silent confession. By allowing these details to slip into the public domain, the palace effectively neutralized the victim narrative being projected from Montecito. Instead of a personal act of vengeance by a father, the eviction was now framed as a systemic purification, a necessary step to protect the public purse and the very survival of the crown. William's strategy was clear. The monarchy doesn't just manage feelings, it manages the truth. However, the real cliffhanger emerged from a leaked memo titled, "She Deserves More Than Silence." This document, believed to be from a Sussex loyalist, threatened to release counterfiles that could implicate other senior royals if the eviction notice was not rescinded. The war was no longer contained within the palace walls. It had become a survival test for a 1,000-year-old institution that was now forced to admit that it, too, can bleed from within. While the public focused on the drama of the eviction notice, Prince William was busy finalizing a ruthless contingency plan that would ensure the Sussexes could never again threaten the stability of the crown. William, acting as the ultimate insider who knows how the palace machine operates, realized that a simple eviction from a house was not enough. He needed to establish a protocol of permanent exile that would legally and administratively liquidate the Sussexes' remaining influence within the British establishment. This was the new king, moving from sentimentality to a model of survival of the institution. The secret behind this contingency was a series of new loyalty and transparency protocols that William reportedly pushed through the Privy Council. These protocols mandate that any member of the royal family living abroad must undergo a full financial and security audit twice a year to maintain their titles or any association with the monarchy. For Harry and Meghan, this was a checkmate move. By refusing to comply, they would automatically trigger a clause that strips the mask and removes their last vestiges of royal protection. But by complying, they would expose the very financial doomsday files they had fought to keep hidden. William's strategy was to manage perception by creating a legal framework that made Harry's return impossible without a total surrender. He reportedly told his father, King Charles, that the monarchy doesn't just manage feelings, it manages reality. This was a sharp contrast to the old palace way of pretending nothing ever breaks. William was rewriting the script to ensure that the crown's future was no longer a harmless fairy tale subject to celebrity whims. The tension reached its breaking point when a leaked document, allegedly part of William's contingency plan, hinted at the total removal of the Sussexes from the line of succession based on constitutional incompatibility. This wasn't just about a home. It was a purge designed to cauterize the wound of the past decade. As the palace gates physically and legally closed, the message from the new king was undeniably clear. No more hiding, no more compromises. Harry and Meghan were no longer just evicted, they were being deleted from the royal narrative forever. The implementation of the protocol of permanent exile acted as a silent detonator beneath the foundations of the Montecito estate, sending psychological and financial tremors through every room of the Sussex mansion. This was the definitive moment the mask finally slipped for the Sussex brand, as the sudden withdrawal of royal protection triggered a catastrophic domino effect across their global business ventures. Major corporate partners, who had once flocked to the couple for their royal stardust, began to realize that the Sussex narrative was fragile and self-serving once it was no longer anchored to the ancient power of the crown. Without the institutional shielding provided by the palace, the couple found themselves exposed to the harsh reality of a market that values results over royal complaints. For years, they had operated under the assumption that the palace machine would remain reactive and defensive, but King Charles's new policy of total transparency changed the rules of the game overnight. The truth was being dragged out in the most unflattering way possible, humanizing their struggles not as a noble quest for privacy, but as a series of calculated branding failures that no longer carried the weight of sovereign authority. The breaking point arrived when their media deals, once worth hundreds of millions, were subjected to the scrutiny of a new monarchy script that prioritized dignity and service over celebrity gossip. The monarchy proved that it doesn't just manage feelings, it manages the very conditions of survival, and at this stage, the Sussex Empire was failing the test. Their once impenetrable wall of PR was replaced by a vulnerable realization that they had been outplayed by a system that had finally admitted it can bleed, choosing to heal itself by cutting them out of the narrative forever. As their professional circle tightened and the silence from London became deafening, the mask of independence was replaced by a cold fear of irrelevance. The palace had dropped its guard just enough to tell a story of accountability, and in doing so, it left Harry and Meghan stranded in a gilded cage of their own making. The legacy of secrecy had come to a bitter end, proving that without the shadow of the throne, the Sussex brand was little more than a fading echo of a story the world had already moved past. The atmosphere within Buckingham Palace grew heavier than ever as the legal battle and centuries of tradition collided in a final, decisive confrontation. This was no longer a private family dispute that could be resolved with quiet apologies or vague press releases. It had escalated into a total war within the court of public opinion and the Privy Council. King Charles found himself facing a brutal survival test, forced to choose between his identity as a grieving, hopeful father and his duty as a sovereign sworn to protect the sanctity of a 1,000-year-old institution. The tension reached its breaking point when palace attorneys presented a classified dossier that exposed the Sussexes' final attempts to legally challenge the validity of the eviction. The secret to this chapter lies in the raw, head-on collision between two incompatible eras of the monarchy. While Harry relied on modern arguments of personal liberty and individual safety, Prince William had already meticulously constructed a new royal script where loyalty served as the non-negotiable prerequisite for any privilege. For the first time in modern history, King Charles authorized his legal team to use evidence of a profound betrayal of trust as the foundation for stripping away all remaining royal perks. This was the ultimate pivot that stunned those who still clung to the hope of reconciliation, as the king finally dropped the mask of paternal mercy to safeguard the legacy of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. The final verdict was delivered in the shadowed silence of a private room at Windsor Castle, with only Charles and William present to witness the end of an era. Internal reports suggest the king remained silent for hours, staring at the portraits of his ancestors as if seeking a historical mandate for what he was about to do. Ultimately, he chose the path of systemic purification, signing a decree that not only upheld the eviction but also permanently froze all financial support from his private estate. This was a painful, silent confession that the bond of blood had been irrevocably severed by ambitions that the crown could no longer accommodate or ignore. The true twist in this battle was the palace's newfound lack of fear regarding potential retaliation or further leaks from the Sussex camp. By choosing to face the pain head-on and proactively addressing the reasons behind this cold resolve, Charles managed to humanize the image of a king who must endure immense personal suffering to put the nation first. The palace gates were not just closed with wood and iron, but with a moral judgment that Harry and Meghan would be forced to carry for the rest of their lives. The monarchy had proved that it could bleed, but it also proved that it was willing to cut away its own flesh to ensure that the heart of the crown continues to beat. The final decree issued by King Charles was far more than a simple conclusion to Harry and Meghan's physical presence in the United Kingdom. It served as the opening salvo for a new royal order, a dynasty defined by absolute transparency and iron discipline under the quiet but decisive leadership of Prince William. As the gates of Frogmore Cottage were permanently locked, the palace did not descend into the chaos many had feared. Instead, it initiated a profound restructuring of the very DNA of royal power. William successfully transformed a messy family crisis into a strategic opportunity to purge the celebrity-driven elements that had threatened to dilute the monarchy's sovereign legitimacy for over a decade. The ultimate secret revealed in this new era is a radical shift in how the institution communicates with the public. There is no longer any room for ambiguous statements or the shielding of personal failures under the guise of privacy. The Kung Dain now operates as a high-functioning modern political entity where every privilege is inextricably linked to absolute accountability. The eviction of the Sussexes has become the ultimate case study, a stern warning to any family member who might consider placing personal ambition above the survival of the crown. This was the moment the palace machine truly learned to heal itself through the weaponization of truth, no matter how brutal that truth might be. The final image etched into the public consciousness is that of King Charles standing alongside William and Kate on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, looking down at the crowds with a newfound, steely resolve. The mask of paternal vulnerability has been replaced by an unbreakable symbol of succession. They have proven to the world that the monarchy is not a harmless fairy tale of glittering crowns, but a fierce battle for survival where those who remain are the ones willing to sacrifice personal emotion for the ultimate good of the nation. Harry and Meghan are now relegated to a closed chapter of history, a haunting reminder of the cost of betrayal in a system that never forgets and never forgives.